Well, how's it going, friends and family? My name is Amos, and here's a fun fact. I have sweaty nipples. That's obvious. But prior to becoming a stay-at-home dad, I used to be on the strategy team for a pharmaceutical company that dividend growth investors seem to know and love. I'm not going to name which one, you could probably guess. So all that to say, I know strategy team sounds fancy, but it's really not. I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a researcher, I was the business guy that was making sure that on a high level, the vision was being executed according to the game plan. So making sure that everyone was aligned with making the drugs and vaccines pan out the way that the executive team and the shareholders wanted to see. Now, if you're a friend of the YouTube channel, then you know that I do not invest into pharmaceutical stocks. After experiencing being in the industry and working alongside with the scientists, the FP&A, the HR team, the marketing team, the manufacturing team, I stay away. So I made a dedicated video explaining and articulating my thoughts as to why that is. However, in this two-part series, I'm going to give a fresh perspective and my take on if I had to. Let's go ahead and assume that somebody is holding a hammer to my left kneecap and they're like, dude, I'm going to smash your knee unless you pick and choose a pharmaceutical stock to invest into. I'm going to say which one it's going to be and why. And in order to do that, we're going to be talking about every single one of the popular pharmaceutical stocks, and I'll even give a grade ranking for each one of them. So if that sounds good with you, let's go ahead and get into it. This is part one, by the way. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist with a PhD to realize that some pharmaceutical stocks, they're selling off beyond belief. Like when you think about value investing, some of you are confusing the crappy pharmaceutical stocks as value when I see value traps. So what exactly is going on? So this article from the Wall Street Journal, it was just published on November the 25th. Here in Japan, it's the 27th. Oh, happy Thanksgiving. The U.S. negotiates lower prices for Ozempic and 14 other drugs. So because of this negotiation, how much they're willing to pay the reimbursement from the insurance, Medicare is going to save an estimated $12 billion in drug spending. So whose pockets will that hit? The pharma companies. The article goes on to say the highest profile drug subject to this year's price cuts was Novo Nordisk, the Ozempic, the weight loss drug. The U.S. government negotiated lower prices in the federal Medicare program for 15 high-selling medicines, including Ozempic. And the new prices will take effect in 2027. And here's the kicker. It's going to be a reduction of 38 to 85% from the MSRP, how much they're trying to charge. Because when you think about pharmaceutical companies, for the longest time, dude, they've been price gouging. I don't know if you know that or not, but here in the US, the exact same drug made by the exact same manufacturer will cost 5, 10, sometimes up to 20 times more than our neighboring countries. They'll get the exact same drug at a fifth of the cost, at a fraction of the cost. And I think the United States government, the people, the citizens, investors, average people like you and I, we're waking up and realizing like, dude, these pharmaceutical companies, yes, they're doing amazing work, life-saving work, but the fact that they're price gouging and overcharging, it's not sitting well with people. And that's why Medicare's like, hey, we're going to pump the brakes. You're trying to sell it to us for $600 a piece. And I know it only costs you $30 to pay for the R&D, the overhead costs, the scientists, to get it out to market. So we'll pay you $45. So that's exactly what's happening with Novo Nordisk and Ozempic. So the bottom line up front is that there's going to be less revenue potential for pharmaceutical companies because they're not going to be able to charge the outrageous prices that they are towards Medicare. And if you're angry about why your health insurance costs so freaking much, well, if you look left and right, is it because of the pharmaceutical companies that are price gouging us? Or is it because one visit to the hospital will set you back $50,000 because an IV bag is like $500, the ambulance trip itself is like $10,000? Or is it because the health insurance companies are greedy themselves? Because somebody has to pay for the drugs and the medicine, right? So an insurance company has to cover that bill. And that's why I think this is a very unpopular opinion, but the healthcare system in the United States, absolutely convoluted. It's too complicated, and they're price gouging left and right towards each other. Between you and me, it's a broken system. That's why I personally think it needs a rehaul. It needs a transformation from the ground up. The framework right now that we're operating in, it's just a hot mess. Because here's the story time. When I was dating my wife prior to getting married, we were living in South Korea, and she had to go to the doctor at the local hospital because of an emergency. And obviously, she's an American, so she doesn't have the health insurance in Korea, nor do they take the health insurance from America. And so after she got done with her consultation and treatment, the front staff, I guess the nurse, they were like, this is going to be very expensive. We're really sorry. And they were saying this in Korean. And my wife was like, okay, how much? They're like, $15. The equivalent in United States dollars, $15. And we both looked at each other and were like, that's it? $15? Because in the United States, if you go to urgent care, if you go to the emergency room, easily $500, maybe $2,000, maybe sometimes $20,000. In other first world countries, you go to Germany, you go to Japan, you go to Korea, you go to the UK, Sweden, Netherlands, dude, it doesn't cost that much. And that's why understanding the world economics and how other countries have excellent healthcare systems that don't cost an arm and a leg, literally, I know that the US, our system is broken. Because I'm not trying to defend United Health or Humana or even Blue Cross Blue Shield, but those health insurance premiums that you pay every month, the cost would come down if the drugs, the vaccines, and the treatment didn't cost $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, when in actuality, they could still make profits from charging a fraction of that. So just something to think about. But the health insurance companies aren't innocent either, because they do deny life-saving treatment and plans because the numbers don't add up for their actuaries. So it's a broken system. Anyways, the article goes on to say, for some patients, the lower prices could reduce spending on copays. All that to say, pharmaceutical companies are going to make less money. Other than Novo Nordisk, who are the other pharmaceutical companies that are going to be taking a financial hit from this? Because Medicare is not going to pay them as much. By the way, if you're not in the know, Medicare is basically the taxpayer healthcare insurance that we have in the United States. It's usually catered towards our vulnerable population, like the elderly, the disabled, the handicapped. And as such, because it's funded by the taxpayers, there's very little to zero out-of-pocket costs. So Medicare is like, dude, we're not going to pay you that much anymore. So Pfizer, GSK, and Merck. So alongside with Novo Nordisk. And the reason why Medicare is pumping the brakes is because right now they spend more than $150 billion a year on these drugs, on these treatment plans. That's $150 billion that are going into the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies. This I know very well. Of course, there's also private insurance, and then the wealthy and elite that just pay for everything out of pocket. They don't even bother with insurance. But these are the other pharmaceutical companies that are affected. So Bristol Myers Squibb, BMS, they were charging $21,700 for a 30-day supply for their multiple myeloma treatment, pills, drugs. Now they're saying we're only going to pay you a maximum of $8,650. I don't care how much you're trying to charge us. That's the max we'll pay. So Bristol Myers Squibb, they're going to have to accept it, right? Because they still need to make that money. Because if you're going to spend all that time, energy, and research to develop that drug to go to market, GTM, after all the clinical trials and regulatory hurdles, they're going to accept it. They're not going to be like, no, that's too little. No, they're going to take whatever they can take. And they're still making a fat profit off of that. It's $8,650. Another one is AstraZeneca, $14,200 for their lymphoma medicine. Now Medicare's like, no, $8,600. Who else? Pfizer's breast cancer treatment. It's slashed in half. $15,000 for a 30-day supply. Now they're only going to pay $7,800. And then you have some boutique and small pharmaceutical companies. And then there's another big one right here, AbbVie, depression and bipolar disorder, $1,300, slashing it down to $770. That's the max that Medicare will pay. And then they're going to accept it. There's also Novo Nordisk. Yeah, Ozempic is slashed, going from $950 down to $270. And to be honest with you, that's not a ridiculous price to begin with. Because some of these drugs and pills, that's a pretty penny. $21,000, but going from $950 down to $270, and as you scroll down, the blow and the slashing, it's not that bad. GSK, I think they're based in the UK, and I think one trend that I'm noticing, the companies that are based in Europe, like Novo Nordisk and GSK, they're not trying to charge an arm and a leg, but they're still getting slashed. Whereas the American companies like Bristol Myers Squibb, AstraZeneca, and Pfizer, they're trying to charge as much as possible, and they're getting slashed as well. So it's kind of interesting to see. But anyways, circling back to the article, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services said that these new negotiated prices, it's going to reduce net spending by 44%. That's, dude, just think about it right now. All of those companies that we talked about, their potential revenue that they're going to be making from Medicare health insurance from people that are age 71, 75, 88, usually it's correlated with health conditions the older you are, right? Because the longer that you live, the more problems that can happen in the body. Cancerous cells, diabetes, cardiovascular setbacks, and whatnot. So I would argue Medicare makes up a good chunk of their revenue potential. They're going to take across the board, a 44% hit. And that's just 2027. Going forward, who is to say it's not going to go down even more? But one thing that I do want to mention is for these 15 drugs that are being reduced for their reimbursement and how much Medicare is willing to pay, there are some big names that I don't see. I don't see Johnson & Johnson. I don't see Eli Lilly. That is just something to keep in mind. And because of these price cuts, they're going to save the Medicare, Medicaid patients about $685 million. But the pharmaceutical companies are not just sitting back and taking the blows. They're saying, dude, this is going to be drastic. This is going to be a devastating blow for us because we're not going to be able to reinvest back into the business for R&D endeavors, as mentioned right here. Medicare's like, I don't care. Figure it out. You guys are charging way too much. So, friends and family, that's one reason as to why companies like Pfizer, companies like Novo Nordisk, why they are selling off. Because their revenue potential going into next year, because the markets are always forward looking, their revenue potential just took a huge hit. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the more popular pharmaceutical stocks, and they're ranked right now based on their market capitalization, how much their stock price is worth on the amount of shares outstanding. So number 1 is Eli Lilly, number 10 is Pfizer. So we're going to be making our way down this list. And right off the bat, if we take a look at some of the numbers, this is the change in their share price for the past 365 days. Novo Nordisk down 53%. Whereas almost every other pharmaceutical company in the top 10 except for Pfizer, they're in the green by a significant amount, right? Eli Lilly, 46% into the green. For the past 5 years, our total return only on their share price appreciation is 662%. We got AbbVie at 118%. For Novo Nordisk, it's just, oof. That's a heavy blow, right? And even though Eli Lilly has been crushing it for this year and the past 5 years, their PE ratio on average, their price to earnings ratio is a 52, right? Right now they're at a 54. I would argue they're neither undervalued or overvalued. However, if you take a look at Johnson & Johnson, when they used to have Kenvue, the consumer health products arm of the business, still with them, their PE ratio was a 45. However, right now, Johnson & Johnson is at a 20. So just judging by valuations, that's makes me want to investigate further, right? And then we got AbbVie, traditionally for the past 10 years, a 35.8. As of right now, it's a 172. So surface level, without even examining any further, I know that they're trading for a premium. That means the markets are pricing in high expectations, or they just had something really weird happen to their balance sheet where they had a write-off, or their asset is no longer how much they thought it is. So their earnings look smaller than they actually are. For Novo Nordisk, I mean, we just read that article together, right? It makes sense. Historically, past 10 years, their PE ratio is a 26. Right now, it's a 13. That's kind of crazy, okay? For Pfizer, historically a 19. Now it's a 14.9. And mind you, Pfizer, they were one of the big 3 or 4 pharmaceutical companies responsible for the COVID-19 vaccine. To see a negative 29% return in 5 years, I don't know about you, but that's unacceptable. That's really bad. And that's why whenever I see dividend investors pumping or promoting Pfizer, I just chuckle. I'm like, man, you guys have no idea what you're talking about, right? Anyways, I wanted to start things backwards. Let's talk about Pfizer first. Let's examine their numbers, and I'll give you my thoughts and opinions as we do so, okay? So for the past 1 year, let's take a look at their stock price history. It looks like they're rebounding, right? Because in April, everybody in the stock market got absolutely shattered. They reached 21.59, and they're slowly making that recovery. Back in October the 2nd, they had a nice pop. Actually, that's October the 3rd at $27. Then they went on a steep sell-off. Not too bad. I would argue they're pretty much flat in the past 1 year. Jump on over to their financials tab, take a look at their revenue. This is where it gets kind of blah, because their revenue visually looks kind of flat, but if you look at it closer, it does seem to be growing, but at a very inconsistent rate, right? Sometimes it's going up from $48 billion 2015 to that $52 billion 2016, and then it went off a cliff. And it dropped down to, $40 billion in 2018. And then obviously in 2021, 2022, they had that catalyst, that black swan event with the vaccinations. And they jumped up to $101 billion of revenue. And it makes absolute sense. However, what happened in 2023, 2024, and as of right now, COVID-19 is no longer the huge threat, an existential crisis like it was back then. And as such, their growth driver through the vaccine fell off a cliff, and now they're back down to more modest numbers. And I would argue it's pretty much flat from 2024 to 2025, $63 billion to $62 billion. So my assessment of their top line, I really do not like what I just saw. It's very inconsistent and it's very volatile. And despite having the COVID-19 wind in their sails, it's still very lackluster to be looking at. You would feel like after all that success and making all of those profits, they would have reinvested it back into the business so that they have a new catalyst or new reason to grow and thrive. But it just shows me and tells me that the leadership team that's steering the ship at Pfizer, I'm like, what are you guys doing? But I can't really blame them because that's the nature and the beast of pharmaceutical companies. You'll have something that's really hot, and then eventually with due time, it's not. You'll lose that growth driver. And in the case of Pfizer, their one-time catalyst, growth machine, doesn't even matter anymore. And as a fundamentals and financials kind of guy, their earnings per share, it insults me. I'm triggered. I'm offended right now. Where is my safe space? Because how are you going to tell me that in 2015, your profits per share was $1.11, and now it's only $1.73? This is exactly what you don't want to see in a dividend compounder with cheese. To see your profits per share to be this freaking volatile, it follows suit with their very volatile and tumultuous revenue. Not my cup of tea so far. And to make matters worse, I'm referring to my notes right here, their patent protections are falling off next year and in 2027 for most of their blockbuster drugs. And they don't have any major drugs to replace the lost income. However, because they know their patents are expiring and they're screwed, not too long ago, in 2023, Pfizer, they decided to spend $43 billion in order to acquire Seagen. So I think that kind of explains why their EPS took a huge hit. Where we at? Right here. Why it took a 93% drop year over year, because they had to spend the money to buy out an up-and-coming pharmaceutical company because they knew they were screwed. So they spent $43 billion, and because of that, they got to take over all of the R&D for Seagen and their drug pipelines in the cancer market. And what's really interesting about Seagen is that, believe it or not, they're best in class when it comes to ADC IV infusions. So for the most part, when it comes to treating chronic diseases, viruses, illnesses, cancers, and whatnot, there's multiple different modalities, right? You can take pills, you can take surgery, treatment plans, light therapy, whatever. ADCs is essentially where you hook an IV to your vein and you inject the ADCs that'll help destroy the cancerous cells but leave alone the healthy ones. I think that's pretty innovative technology, but only time will tell whether or not that's a fruitful strategy because, ever since they acquired Seagen, their revenue is not exactly growing at a phenomenal rate, right? 6% 2023 to 2024 and then 3.8% trailing 12 months. Take a look at their free cash flow. For a pharmaceutical company, their free cash flow needs to be super flush. If it's not, if it's negative, that's a huge red flag. Because once a drug or treatment passes through all of the phases and the regulatory hurdles and it goes to market, the profit margins are ridiculous. So they should have cash just pouring right through their pockets. And in the case of Pfizer, what exactly are we seeing? We're seeing that in 2015, it's going from $13 billion down to $10 billion. In the span of 10 years, you're telling me that your free cash flow dropped by $3 billion in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, if we smooth it out and take a look at 2021, 2022, that was impressive, right? But that's in the past. Why did Pfizer not sustain that? Why did it not go to 30 billion or 40 billion? Why did it fall off a cliff? Well, we know why. And so even though someone might be very impressed by this, that's the past. What are you doing right now? And right now it's $10 billion, which is less than 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and dare I say about even with 2019 prior to the Black Swan event. So financials wise, I'm not too thrilled or impressed when it comes to Pfizer. Hopefully their balance sheet, their books look better. Their cash and cash equivalents, we're looking at $14.9 billion. Over the grand scheme of things, it's been dropping. Not exactly what you want to see, but in the past 500 days, it is making the right trend. It's up 50%, which is good. Not the best. It's good. Their total debt is $61.9 billion. So if you take all the cash on the books and you pay down the debt hypothetically, they would still have $46.9 billion of obligations. That's how leveraged they are. That's a lot. However, how I like to assess the sustainability of the debt on the books is through the debt to EBITDA ratio when you divide it by the core operating profits. And the debt to EBITDA ratio, the golden standard is a 3 or below. That means it would hypothetically take a company 3 years of maintaining their core operating profits to pay down their debts. Now for Pfizer, it would take them 2.5 years because I see a 2.4. So even though the debt situation might look scary, I think it's absolutely manageable. However, still, it's not a great picture to see that their cash and cash equivalent situation is just all over the place. And I think that's how they're funding their dividend. Because their dividend right now is $1.72 per share, right? If you divide that by the EPS, obviously it's a 99.6%. That means 99% of their profits are being allocated towards the dividend. However, I think because of the Seagen acquisition, I think their numbers are going to be all wonky, and that's why sometimes as a litmus test, as a benchmark, you can refer to their own free cash flow. Their free cash flow per share is $1.82. So I can tell you right now that this dividend, the payout ratio, no matter how you spin it, twist it, pull it, manipulate it, it's going to be around 90 to 99%. Very high. And if they want to continue to sustain it without furthering the growth of their free cash flow or profits, the net income, they're going to have to dip into the cash that's on their books or take on loans. So even though someone might be salivating at the idea of a 6.7% dividend yield, I can tell you that this might not be sustainable unless they execute and they turn this ship around and start growing again. But the thing is, when it comes to Pfizer, their own drug and R&D pipeline is not looking too hot. So they went all in, put their marbles into one basket of the Seagen acquisition. So for Pfizer right now, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not feeling it. I think Wall Street has it right. There's literally no reason and compelling evidence for us to believe that they're going to be the next Eli Lilly. Now, granted, Seagen could become the next big thing. But as of right now, what are the fruits that it's bearing? It's not that great. It's not that fantastic. Because the reason why I'm talking like that is once we start looking at some of the other pharmaceutical companies on this list, you'll quickly realize, dude, Pfizer's numbers are absolutely trash. And that's why I think when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, I'm going to give you some insider knowledge right here. The more robust and diversified the drug or R&D pipeline is, the more resilient their business model will be. Because the patents that protect their exclusivity, whatever drug or pill, vaccine that we're talking about, it always comes with a time limit. And what I mean by that is once the patents wear off, any pharmaceutical company based in India, China, they can manufacture those drugs at a penny. The cost for them to do business, super low, and they will just flood the markets. So if you are a low income or a budget conscious consumer, why would you ever want to pay $36 or $42 for I don't know, a 30-day supply of Claritin when you can get the generic brand from Costco or Sam's Club. You can get 400 pills for $14, right? So the patents that wear off, a huge devastating blowback for pharmaceutical companies. And that's why you always need a fresh supply of drugs flowing through the pipeline of the R&D landscape. And in the case of Pfizer, if their stock price explodes because of a one-time miracle drug or vaccine, like it did back during the COVID era, I mean, at one point, Pfizer was roughly $60 a share. They have fallen so far, you almost want to feel bad for them, right? To be $25 when they were just at $60 because of a one-time miracle drug, it sucks. So, like Pfizer, if that one-time miracle catalyst goes away, it's only time before the competitor will launch an equivalent product and then they lose their economic moat. So they might be the first ones, like in the case of Novo Nordisk with Ozempic, the drug that helps you to lose weight, but now there's so many different varieties and versions and flavors of that GLP-1, the Ozempic, right? Eli Lilly has one, and I'm sure there's other Chinese pharmaceutical companies that have one. Is there really pharmaceutical companies that are producing one? The markets are going to be flooded. They no longer have an economic moat. So it's not just the patents wearing off, but also given time, a lot of these research firms can reverse engineer and then also make their own variety of that drug that makes you so special. And that's why when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, I think if you're not going to be a hands-on investor, like staying up to date and watching the news and updates surrounding the pharmaceutical stock that you're invested into, it might behoove of you to stay away. And that's not financial advice. I'm just telling you, if you don't understand the pharmaceutical landscape, they are a very complex beast. This is not your normal Hershey that sells chocolate and candy. This is not your Microsoft that's in the business of cloud and Blizzard games. Pharmaceuticals, it's a really complicated battlefield with really high margins for the top dogs. For the bottom ones, I would argue the bottom 95% of pharmaceutical companies, they probably operate at a loss because they don't have that unicorn drug or pill. So they're constantly pushing money into trying to develop the next big thing. And then for the smaller fish in the sea, their dream and hope is not to become the next Novo Nordisk or Johnson & Johnson. Their biggest desire and wish is to be acquired, just like Seagen. So when it comes to the pharmaceuticals, it is that much more important to stay up to date with their earnings that they publish every 90 days because they give us status reports of their drug and research pipelines. So while we're talking about Pfizer, let's hop on over to their earnings, most recent one, to take a look at their drug pipeline. Now, if you're invested into Pfizer and you're not staying up to date with their drug pipeline and their updates, dude, what are you doing? And I'm not saying that to call you out, to shame you or guilt you. It's like, dude, you have to understand. If you are a shareholder of a stock or a business, you are a part owner of that operation. So if you don't even understand what they're doing, dude, I would question anything that you're doing, right? You have to understand and know what you own. You don't just wake up one day and try to drive stick shift without ever learning how to do it on a YouTube manual, right? You would at least practice and know how to drive stick shift before you try to merge onto the highway. Likewise, with a pharmaceutical, you have to stay up to date with their drugs and their research. So it's usually always at the bottom, the very end. So there it is. Pfizer's 2025 pipeline catalyst. Let's see, they have 4 drugs that are about to go to market. I mean, 2 seem like they're good to go. There's one that's up in the air and one that they're just feeling like we don't know, okay? And there's a handful that's in the phase 3. So there's 3 phases and then 1 regulatory hurdle, basically having the FDA and the government agency sign off, bless you off, saying, okay, you can start selling it to the masses. Getting through phase 1, that's where a lot of these drugs fail and bust. Getting to phase 2, it's super, super difficult. Once you get to phase 3, that's when investors in Wall Street, that's when they start to feel bullish because you're almost at the finish line of getting that drug or pill to market. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the high level. Take a look at it right here. So they have 2 drugs that are going into phase 2. They have a handful of drugs that are going into phase 3, and they have 2 that are about to go GTM, and there's 1 that's now rolling out, and it's a COVID-19 I'm guessing like a booster shot, it says for everyone that's over the ages of 65 or anyone that has an immune system that's compromised. So that's approved and out. These two, they're waiting to get the blessings from the government. And you have to understand, like, does the market that they're trying to serve, does it have a sizable, addressable consumer base? When you think about a very niche disease or virus, the revenue potential for that pharmaceutical endeavor is not the highest, such as a weight loss drug, Ozempic. Because what is it, like 40 or 50% of Americans are like technically obese or overweight? That's a huge customer base. But when you start thinking about a very rare condition that only affects like 1 out of 1 million people, the addressable market for that, and that's why when you look at what it's supposed to do, you also have to bake in the idea of like, what's the revenue driver for this? So like this drug right here, right? Nurtec, it's going to address menstrually related migraines. Now, when you think about our fellow women out here, some of us, when we have our periods, like when I do, dude, I feel all out of whack. I get headaches. So this right here, a huge, sizable market. Now, what's a differentiator from that? And I don't know, Tylenol or Advil. So with that, I would kind of take a step back and be like, okay, yeah, it's in the phase 3, but what makes them different? And that's why the marketing team for a pharmaceutical company is going to be that much more important. To make the consumer start to ask their providers about Nurtec. Dude, I'm feeling all of this. I'm on my period. Are you starting to understand the pharmaceutical space? Yes. Now do you believe that I used to work for them on the strategy side of the house? And then the phase 2, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. Only once they get to phase 3, or dare I even say once they get to the regulatory hurdle phase right here, registration, that's when the eyes should open. I know, you probably just made a racist joke to yourself. My eyes are open, okay? Don't be that wise guy. Phase 2, I'm going to tell you right now, the probability and likelihood of them getting bust or failing is higher than them moving on to phase 3. That's the nature of the pharmaceutical space. So hopefully you understand, and I think that's going to conclude part 1. Now in part 2, now that we understand everything, we can go faster as we dissect and analyze the other pharmaceutical companies. So if you're not already, I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel. If not, it's okay. I love you guys. Stay safe. Good luck in the stock market, and I will talk to you next time.